To hear this audiobook in full, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support. The Battle for China's Past, Mao and the Cultural Revolution by Mobo Gao, first published 2008. To my father Gao Renfa and mother Jiang Yuanrong, whose whole lives were devoted to the well-being of their children. To those who sacrificed their lives for the improvement of living conditions of the poor and the disadvantaged. Acknowledgements. This book has been in process for several years and has been the result of discussions with and feedback from many friends and colleagues. I take this opportunity to thank all of those who cannot be named here. I would also like to thank Martin Hart Landsberg, who made detailed comments and extensive suggestions after reading the whole draft, and Greg Benton, who has also read the whole draft and gave valuable suggestions and advice. Their help has had an essential impact on the final product, though of course they are not responsible for the errors and mistakes. I would also like to thank Yan Hairong, who never fails to give her support, either scholarly or personally, and Kaz Ross, who went through the draft at one go and made valuable comments and suggestions. I would also like to express my appreciation of the anonymous reviewers for their support of this book and for their suggestions for improvement. I, of course, must thank David Castle, the commissioning editor of Pluto Press. David is not only quick, decisive, and most professional, but also extremely supportive, always ready to accept any author's suggestions that may be beneficial in bringing the publication to fruition. The team at Pluto Press has to be acknowledged to be thoroughly professional as well as highly sympathetic. Introduction. In 2004, at a friend's party, I met a Mr. Chen, an energetic recent migrant from the People's Republic of China, PRC, in his late 50s. Chen works for a profitable company in Australia, and his main task is selling timber products to China. He mentioned to me that he was in the process of signing a large deal. Chen was confident that in 20 years' time China would overtake Japan economically, and he talked about how China has been developing fast and so on. In order to quell what I thought was an unbalanced enthusiasm, I mentioned that China was not a high-tech producer, but just a place for foreign companies to exploit cheap labor, the assembling factory of the world. I pointed out to him the fast-emerging social inequalities, that a rural migrant worker may have to work 16 or more hours a day for 7 days a week to earn about $80 a month, and that perhaps this is not something that can be called development. Chen replied, $80 is good enough for a peasant. I could not help but ask, would you accept that kind of payment and life? That is not the same. Tamun sujur di. They are low-quality people, he said. Then the topic turned to what I was going to do in China for my research. I said I would like to go back to Gao village area to find out what the rural people think of the Cultural Revolution. He was genuinely surprised.
To study the Cultural Revolution? Why do you want to find out what the rural people think? Rural China was not much affected by the Cultural Revolution.
I replied that the majority of Chinese are in rural China. If rural China was not much affected by the Cultural Revolution, why do you, the CCP, and many of the elite intelligentsia keep repeating that the Cultural Revolution was a 10-year calamity for China? To which Chen said, "You have very strange concepts." This book is about such strange concepts, so strange that they challenge the mainstream orthodox narrative. It questions many truths told in memoirs, biographies, and autobiographies, both in Chinese and English. It endeavors to find out whether these perspectives, which are officially considered to be unorthodox and strange, may be widely shared by most ordinary people in China, the farmers and workers. If they are, the book aims to analyze the reasons behind this gap between the official and unofficial, and between the mainstream positions of the elite intelligentsia in orthodox historiography and opposing views expressed in the e-media. To many outside China, especially those who have grown up with European cultural traditions, China is an enigma, a place so different that a first visit is most often a culture shock. On the other hand, and somewhat paradoxically, China's increasing similarity to the developed world is seen as a threat. For many inside China, however, despite the Maoist revolutions, the West has for over a century and a half been the yardstick of material progress and development, and also of spiritual and personal development. Yet notwithstanding this view within China, there is a Western perception that the Chinese were or are anti-Western, China-centered, and xenophobic. On the other hand, almost every time a politician or head of a state visiting China does not take a tough stand against China, as is perceived to be necessary on, for example, the issue of human rights, the mainstream Western media accuses that government or that politician of kowtowing to China. The apparently huge gap between these conflicting images and perceptions of China requires interpretation and understanding. This book engages with that task. The possibility, and I still think it is only a possibility, that China may rise to a leading position on the international stage makes China a hot contemporary topic. The notable economic development in China is being hailed not only as a result of post-Mao reform, but also as a proof that the era of Mao was a communist-inspired disaster. This book shows that that position is dangerously misleading in 4 ways. First, it deprives a probable majority of the Chinese of the right to speak up. Second, it hides the ugly fact that there are millions of people who are actually worse off since the post-Mao reform years. Third, it denies the enormous achievements made during the Mao era that paved the way for later development. Finally, it is misleading, and it distracts from and precludes imaginings of alternative models of development and other possible forms of human organization. Many issues surrounding the Mao era need to be re-examined and new interpretations provided. For example, where in the scale of historical achievement and worth does Mao stand? Are the ideas and practices carried out under his leadership relevant and significant to today's China? To judge from much of the writings in memoirs, biographies, and autobiographies, such as Li Jisui's Private Life of Mao, Jung Chang, and John Halliday's Mao. The Unknown Story and others written in Chinese, Mao was a callous, calculating, inhumane, power-hungry monster. However, in contrast to those depictions, Mao's bodyguards, nurses, and some others who worked with him, like Chen Boda and Wang Li, show Mao very differently and in a more positive light. These disparate views exemplify the contradictory perceptions and evaluations between various memories on this and related issues. Another example of these polarized views occurred in December 2006, when Deng Xiaoping's son Deng Pufang, who was crippled at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, told a group of journalists that the Cultural Revolution was not only a disaster for himself, but for the whole of the Chinese state and the Chinese people. This almost routine response triggered hundreds of thousands of responses from bloggers and chat rooms. According to an estimate on one website, Xin Lang Wang, only 2 weeks after Deng's remark, there had been more than 20,000 feedback entries, covering a staggering 1,166 pages. One e-media participant who claims to have witnessed the incident states that Deng Pufang was not crippled because he was thrown out of the window by Red Guards, as it is often claimed or assumed, nor because he had jumped. Deng was trying to escape from the room where he was confined by climbing down a sewage pipe. When the old pipe broke, Deng fell onto the concrete below and crippled himself. One seasoned e-media activist, Li Xuanyuan, suggests that Deng Pufang should look into the official statistics and consider how many migrant workers have been crippled each year by mining accidents, or have had their fingers and arms cut off in sweatshops all over China, especially in the developed areas of the southeast coast. An overwhelming majority disagreed with Deng's viewpoint, indicating perhaps a more positive view of the Mao era than was generally expected. Considering that Roderick McFarquhar of Harvard University, a prominent scholar of the Cultural Revolution, fails to recognize that there is a vast majority of people in China who not only remember the era of Mao as the good old days, but who also like and admire the man, there is an urgent need to make available much that is unknown to many. It is important to hear the voice that may resonate among the vast majority of the Chinese, who cannot simply be dismissed as ignorant and brainwashed. We need to remind ourselves that in China, as in any other society, there was and there is a social hierarchy, and that different perceptions by different sectors of Chinese society should be considered equally legitimate. Many Chinese expatriates, such as Young Chang, dislike Mao because they or their families were the victims of Mao's theory and practice of class struggle. On the other hand, people such as rural farmers and urban workers might not have a reason to dislike Mao. For many of them, there may be reasons to think positively of him. History is not simply a picture or reconstruction of what happened. It is our present construction of the past. The way we construct the past depends on how we conceptualize our world and ourselves in the present. Therefore, how one sees the worth of the Mao era depends not only on what one's present circumstances are, but also on one's present values and beliefs. In other words, the way we conceptualize ourselves in the present frames our perception of the past. This book analyses the present values and beliefs of those remembering and retelling the past, and examines the way that these values and beliefs frame our understanding of the past. Of course, there are always a variety of values and beliefs at any given time in any society, but there is always one set that is actually dominant. Regarding the Mao era, there is currently a two-faceted dominant conceptualization, with one facet that is external to China and one that is internal to it, each interacting with the other. The external facet is the rise to predominance of neoliberalism immediately before and after the collapse of the alternative existing communist model of human development. The triumph of the capitalist market economy is the broad conceptualization that frames our understanding and interpretation of our world and ourselves. The internal facet is the farewell to revolution, and therefore the necessity of denouncing the Cultural Revolution totally and thoroughly. The dominant discursive hegemony of neoliberalism and the worldwide conversion to capitalism led to the total denigration of the Cultural Revolution, Mao the man, and the times he so directly influenced, and finally, of the whole idea of populist revolution. This book presents a different conceptualization from that of the neoliberal hegemony, and from its total denigration of the Maoist legacy. Obviously, the book does not attempt to argue that there was nothing wrong with the era of Mao, nor does it attempt to argue that Mao was not responsible for any of the problems and disasters in China under his leadership. It does not attempt to deny that there was violence and brutality inflicted upon millions of people in the name of revolution. Instead, this work attempts to demonstrate that there are other possible interpretations, other evidence and other arguments than the dominant ones. Take the case of the Great Leap Forward as an example. There has been a continuous debate about the death toll of the resulting famine, with scholarly estimates ranging from 18 million to about 30 million deaths, but with recent estimates by an e-media participant as low as 200,000. So the claim by Chang and Halliday that Mao murdered 38 million people, and other claims that he was only partially responsible and that the death tolls were much smaller, need to be reconsidered. There are now so many different interpretations of the Great Leap Forward, and Mao's part in it, that they need to be reevaluated. Clearly, one's values and beliefs orientate one's direction of understanding and even one's selection of evidence for an argument or premise. The Cultural Revolution discourse is a prime example. For many Chinese government officials and members of the intelligentsia who were dismissed from their posts and were ordered to live and work in what was called Wu Qi Gan Xiao, the May 7th cadre school, the experience is now narrated as detention in a labor camp and a violation of fundamental human rights. But for Mao and others at that time, and for many even now, it was intended to create new subjectivity. It was intended that the urban and social elite would experience physical labor so that they would be able to understand and empathize with the reality of life of the majority of the people. It was meant to be an approach to a new way of governing and governance. The Chinese Communist Party's CCP official view of the Cultural Revolution, corresponding to the mainstream Chinese intelligentsia understanding and interpretation, is well received and supported by the Western media and most of the scholarly community. For example, in Thurston's view, the Cultural Revolution led to loss of culture and of spiritual values, loss of hope and ideals, loss of time, truth, and of life. Loss, in short, of nearly everything that gives meaning to life. Thurston, 1984. What Thurston says here more or less summarizes the general evaluation of the Cultural Revolution held by the mainstream Western political, cultural, and scholarly elite. This quote, for instance, is cited by Lucian Pai, a prominent U.S. scholar of Chinese political culture, and by Li, another U.S. scholar on the very subject of the Cultural Revolution. Many others would argue, however, that while the first 2 years of chaos and destruction have been highlighted by the Cold War warriors and neoliberals alike, the positive and constructive years from 1969 to the early 1970s have been forgotten or obscured. These positive legacies include a massive infrastructure program, radical education reforms, innovative experimentation in literature and the arts, expansion of healthcare and education in rural areas, and rapid development of rural enterprises. The Cultural Revolution involved many millions of people who willingly participated in what they saw as a movement to better Chinese society and humanity in general. A whole range of ideas and issues, from politics to education and healthcare, from literature and the arts to industrial and agricultural policies, were examined, tried, and tested. Some of these experiments succeeded, some failed, and some did not have time to come to fruition before they were prematurely terminated. In the sphere of science, for instance, if one takes seriously the stated goals of mass science, then it is clear that there was, contrary to the mainstream claims, a valuable development of science during the Cultural Revolution. The archaeological discoveries at Mawangdui led to the discovery of a Chinese medical remedy for malaria, while the delivery of primary health care, the development of integrated techniques for controlling insect pests, and the advance of earthquake predictions are examples of scientific progress at this time. Particularly notable for popular scientific education is the science of paleoanthropology, guided by the theory that labor creates and defines humanity, and that labor is the driving force behind human development, and that therefore the laboring masses are the bearers of the torch of science. Popular science, such as is exemplified by the magazine Fossils, emerged in spite of resistance from the elite intelligentsia. Mao's political experiment, the Cultural Revolution, like all other social revolutions before it, claimed many victims. It did, however, again like other social revolutions, have some positive outcomes. It encouraged grassroots participation in management, and it also inspired the idea of popular democracy. The mass criticism practiced in the era of Mao in general, and during the Cultural Revolution in particular, though ritualized and mobilized from the top, did provide a rich repertoire of protest techniques. Members of the Red Guards were not just passive followers of a charismatic leader, but agents actively involved in a variety of ideological disputes and contests for power. The Chinese were not the brainless masses manipulated by a ruthless dictator, so often portrayed in the Western media. They must be seen as agents of history and subjects of their own lives like any other people. Anyone who seriously believes in the inherent value of individualism, in the self-evident truth of the human pursuit of happiness, or the universal value of human rights and democracy, should be sympathetic with this position. In the area of industrial development, Mao took a strongly socialist view, concerning himself with eradicating the usual divide between the rural and urban. Under his leadership, a strategy was developed and implemented to trial a decentralized, non-Soviet form of industry program. It was proposed that the rural population could become industrialized without a need to build cities or urban ghettos, a strategy initiated during the Great Leap Forward, shelved because of the famine disaster, but picked up again during the Cultural Revolution. As Wang shows, by the end of the decade of the Cultural Revolution in 1979, there were nearly 800,000 industrial enterprises scattered in villages and small towns, plus almost 90,000 small hydroelectric stations. These enterprises employed nearly 25 million workers and produced an estimated 15% of the national industrial output. This development provided the critical preconditions for the rapid growth of township and village enterprises in the post-Mao reform period. In much of the literature that is reviewed and discussed in this book, the Cultural Revolution is conceptualized as a personal power struggle by Mao, who manipulated the party, the army, the students, and the Chinese people. However, what was proclaimed and recognized during the Cultural Revolution was that a continuous revolution was required for China to remain a socialist country and to achieve its socialist goals. It was recognized that some CCP leaders were nationalist revolutionaries who joined the CCP to fight imperialism and feudalism. Although these leaders tolerated land reform and nationalization of capitalist industry with foreign connections, they did not like the program of rural collectivization and the confiscation of properties owned by the Chinese nationalist capitalists. Liu Shaoqi, for instance, did not even like the idea of agricultural cooperatives in 1951. There was, therefore, a danger that China would return to capitalism unless there were a revolution ostensibly concerned with changing cultural values and beliefs, and that was why it was called the Cultural Revolution. Within the conceptual framework of human rights and neoliberalism, the revolutionary goals and strategy of the Cultural Revolution are seen as pointless victimization of all the political and cultural elite. It is either forgotten or ignored that at the time, Mao stressed that those who really wanted to restore capitalism were a tiny minority, about 1 to 2% within the party. Among this small percentage of capitalist roaders, most could be educated to correct themselves, and only a few could not be changed. Among the small group of die-hard capitalist roaders, Mao stressed that their sons and daughters should not be stigmatized as being the same as their parents. It was clear at that time that the Cultural Revolution was aimed at educating and was not meant to victimize a whole class of people. However, today, this kind of revolutionary conceptualization of tempering new subjectivity is totally forgotten or has become an alien concept. Just as there are alternative views to the official and dominant judgments of the Mao era, there are also alternative views concerning the reform period. Take the case of rural migrant workers as an example of how different conceptual paradigms can frame different interpretations and understandings. Since the late 1980s, every year approximately 100 to 200 million people from rural China have been either looking for jobs or working in the cities. For many neoliberals, such as Professor Qin Hui, This rural exodus has been the second liberation for the peasants, because he says they now have the freedom to move from rural villages to urban areas to work. For many rural Chinese, however, this liberation is deceptive. It provides a sense of freedom to the rural young, who really have no other choice. Teenagers working for an average 14 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, to earn about 600 RMB a month, a rate unchanged for more than a decade until very recently. Under dangerous and hazardous conditions, is this really liberation? Mr. Chen would certainly think so. Perhaps we should consider whether those teenagers would feel more liberated by going to school and college like their urban counterparts. Throughout the book, I argue that our conceptualizations may frame our research methodology and our selection of evidence. However, I am not saying that there should not be methodological conventions or that one method may not be more rigorous than another. Nor am I suggesting that there are not undisputed facts. It is an undisputed fact that the Great Leap Forward contributed towards a famine. Nor is there any dispute that the Cultural Revolution victimized many in terms of personal humiliation, physical assaults, arbitrary detention, loss of property, and even death. But I do argue that there are other facts that should not be ignored and need to be included in any balanced account of China's history. Parallel to the understanding of the Cultural Revolution as a total disaster is the belief that the post-Mao reforms, supposedly designed by the paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, have achieved economic miracles in China. This claim has been repeated in so many different versions that it has become a cliché. However, a counter-narrative is available from some who know Chinese society well. Lao's comments are an example of this.
Now, what can they offer their children? If they make enough money, they hope to send their children abroad so that they have a better life in the United States and never come back to China, because China is going to be hell.
Through in-depth analysis of memoirs, autobiographies, and biographies, by presenting the debate over the Cultural Revolution between liberals and the New Left, and with information gained from fieldwork in rural China and the e-media, the book provides the following: a critique of the contemporary discourse concerning the Mao era, with an emphasis on the Cultural Revolution, and a re-evaluation of the man and his legacy. Documentation of the various narratives and debates, especially in the increasingly important e-media, concerning this period. Analysis and evaluation of these narratives and debates. A general evaluation of the post-Mao reforms in relation to the legacy of the Mao era. A conceptual framework which shows that our present values and beliefs frame our memories of the past. The book is therefore not just about memories of the past, but also about what is happening in the present. It is not just about the Cultural Revolution, Mao the man, and the Mao era. It is also about contemporary China. On a deep level, it is about liberalism versus revolution, and about continuity versus change. It is about alternative models of development, and in a word, it is about our quest for betterment and our understanding of human existence. Chapter 1 opens with a debate on the Cultural Revolution and asks whether it was 10 years of catastrophe. Shi Nian Haojie, who were the Chinese who were adversely affected by it, what were the causes of the violence, and what was the extent of violence, whether there were constructive achievements during the Cultural Revolution, and if so, what were they, and what was the impact on Chinese culture and tradition. This chapter argues that the Cultural Revolution, while very violent, was not a 10-year calamity for China, that the party and elite intelligentsia cannot speak on behalf of all Chinese, that the causes of violence were many, and the extent of violence has been exaggerated, that there were many constructive and creative developments during the Cultural Revolution that have been ignored or denigrated by the post-Cultural Revolution narrative, and that the destruction of culture and tradition has been exaggerated. Much of the discussion focuses on the debate over the question of cultural and religious destruction in Tibet. A major argument is that this was not a result of ethnic strife or Chinese chauvinism or imperialism, but due to the theory of class struggle and was justified by a Marxist interpretation of historical progression. In this regard, this chapter will render support to scholars such as Soutman, 2006, who argues that the Western world, in particular, has been hugely misled by claims of the Tibetan exiles that ethnic or cultural genocide has been committed there, and that the same conception that should inform our opinions about China generally applies with regard to Tibet. That conception is that the oppression of the old society was much more widely experienced by its majority over many centuries than any of the mistakes made during the course of transforming Tibetan society. Chapter 2 develops the argument that memories are not only about events, but also constitute a form of knowledge. The narrative of atrocity of the Cultural Revolution is not just a retelling of past experience, but also an act of identification with certain political and cultural values. From the literature of the wounded, or scar literature, to the calamities discourse of the Cultural Revolution, the retelling of the past can be seen as an act of political identification with certain hegemonic Western political and cultural values. It was a neo-Enlightenment act to retrieve what was seen as being abandoned by the May 4th movement, the striving for a Western vision of humanism and democracy. Since the late 1990s, the denunciation of the Cultural Revolution and the era of Mao has gone hand in hand with the discursive hegemony of neoliberalism. By analyzing the phenomenon of the two whatevers, whatever China does is wrong and whatever the United States does is right, among Chinese neoliberal dissidents, the chapter advances the argument for a correlation between the condemnation of socialist revolution and the elite desire for political and cultural value identification with the West. To hear this audiobook in full, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support.